This pinnacle I asked a man about, or at least I asked him about this whole knob here, and he said city wall. So I'm not sure if the pinnacle was part of the city wall, looks incredibly high, or whether that area beyond it reflects the remains of an old wall. Looks more logical, doesn't it? We're in a heavily Muslim area, and my hosts are Muslim, and so we shall probably hear this starting very early in the morning, 5 times a day. This is sunrise, if you can call it that. More like a smog rise. But that's the kind of environment these folks encounter. LA 40 years ago. There's one way to get rid of the trash, to fill everything. You just have to keep moving it downhill like this gentleman is. Just arrived at the valley. This is Toorji Ka Jhalra. This is astounding. It was this one or one similar to this, I think, or a combination of two of them were used in the movie Dark Knight Batman series. Isn't this astounding? We'll wander around, get different perspectives. This was made by digging out a large trench, and then, where there was of course a well, and then filling it in as you see here. This is not quite as dramatic as it might be after some rains, when we could see more contrasting with those steps and shadows and so forth. Principally and obviously for water, and it allowed for the different elevations of water given the different seasons, not to mention the eons of time. So we'll walk down here as far as we can, but safe. This was also used, these upper portions, as you can imagine, for celebrations, for publics, and casual gatherings. So we'll just start wandering down and getting an impression of what we can. Imagine this in the day when it was not surrounded by all of these other buildings, and yet that building may have been a part of this complex, and certainly this building behind me might have been a part of it. Notice how well worn these stones are. What it is obviously a series of terraces or tiers created by these steps with a landing at the base. So we walk down the stairs, come to this little landing, step down off of 2 levels onto another landing, and down we go further. Now what haunts the imagination here is how much water would fill in here on occasion. Is it possible that these steps served a function when water levels got really, really high? Or is it just that this was a simple way to make a deep construction? Notice we have to be careful about walking down there so we're not. That's all moss covered. Good way to die. But we could easily walk down through here. And there are already some people down below. Keep the camera on. You can see how dicey this seems to me. All things like this are dicey the first time, going down, coming back up. Sometimes it's not so difficult. Now this water is still very, very clean. As you can tell, there are fish down in there, quite a number of them, quite a good size. And these folks are feeding them. And there's a whole ton of them over there. You can just imagine on a hot summer's day how this place might have been jammed with people. Not only gathering water, but picnicking and gathering just for the fun of it. And it might have been a cooler place to gather, obviously, because of the water. One wonders if they had a technique for covering over some of these portions of the water, of these steps, with some kind of large pieces of cloth. You can see from the steps that it goes down further. Who knows how much further. Interesting that water is seeping out up here, and up there you wonder whether that's some kind of water that's just that trashy water we saw flowing down the street, somehow percolating down to here, or whether in fact this is some kind of level of groundwater or other springs that we're encountering. I think at one time that was all open but was just cemented in as a wall to protect the overall structure for time. Back in behind there, I suspect, is where the well was. I'm going to walk down here so that we can look in through that grated door. Notice here water trickling out at a pretty good pace. So we can't go in, but you can imagine that there was a time when, of course, you could. Whether they would dip down with pots and get water, I don't know, or whether they got it always from the base of those steps. A little bit of the remaining carved detail, whether these walls were once painted, as we've seen in some places, who's to know. This little wall is a recent wall, no doubt designed to protect tourists and others who are not as careful as they should be. Here, one of these pedestals that we've seen before, whether it's always been here or not, who knows? And what it symbolizes, I don't know. Whether this was a later addition or meant to be a pool for people who didn't want to climb all the way down to the bottom. The sad thing is that we can't find out more about such a structure. Either the archaeologists haven't figured it out, or if they have, it's not being published, at least in English, on the internet. Amazing structures. Highlighted my trip so far. Presumably down through here in the day you could drop buckets down and haul water up. It's even possible that some of these holes represent supports, like that one, support positions for some kind of wheel device, of course, that would haul the water up. You can see several such indentations, particularly at the corners. My guess is that this little house, if you will, structure was duplicated on this side and may well have been duplicated all the way around here, but was destroyed and removed in deference to the garbage built next to this. There are apparently quite a few, like 50 or 60 of these things in this area. They've all been reduced to rubbish dumps. A classic example of a third world country that has no clue about one of its potential great assets, tourism. And this one, I believe, is not maintained by the government, which shows their corruptive disdain for their own culture and deference to cash. This is a restaurant now. We'll walk inside to get a sense of the ambience, which may reflect how some homes look. This probably was a haveli of some sort. I'm guessing that this may have been the product of, well, I can't tell, of people putting stuff into it. I don't know. Too bad the wealthy don't get it. Unfortunately, his ears broke off some time ago, but boy, would those be beautiful artifacts for those expensive homes. I'm always somewhat jesting when I say that, because I hope that none of this stuff gets to leave India, then it stays here like any other artifact of a culture for future tourists to visit. This is probably part of an old paveli, not too far from the market. One big enough that they spanned over this road, was probably the entrance of the other part of that in someone's home I'm looking into. The other side of that archway. This might have been the actual front. Folks are in the business of renting scaffold type things. You can see these are for painters with ropes and other kinds of paraphernalia that OSHA would never allow even in the United States. The stepwell we're looking for is next to a lake, and guess what? So is this building. That must be a lake. So let's... It's not a stepwell, but it might be referred to as some kind of a pond. It was intended to function that way at one time, but you can see it's just a refuse heap. We'll take a closer look at this lake. In fact, we'll walk around and probe its perimeter as much as we can. Across this street is what I'm looking for. A smaller version of the stepwell we just visited. So we'll make our entrance, and the typical Indian wildlife, that ferocious little, what looks like a chipmunk but isn't. This is apparently maintained by an Irishman. Again, not by the slack Indian government, but maybe Mahdi has to be given the chance. It's haunting and eerie in a way, and we'll find out more about that concept in a moment, just because of the different green moss colors and the sound of dripping water that I hear. So let's walk down into the shadows. Some of this looks new, which is my thanks to whoever had the political clout and foresight to restore this part of it. Notice how these are locked together. Here it appears that water is dripping out of some kind of a spillway up there. God only knows what it is. There's so much water spilling into this. How pretty it must have been in its day, eh? Walk down into that area and see what we can see, since it's not as much blocked off. But you'll notice there's a rope for hauling water up, so that gives us a clue as to how the other one probably was also used. And what's lovely? No tourists. I'm not sure they even come here. It's interesting how this rock is hollowed out a bit, which indicates use usually. I'm standing underneath the cupola opposite that one. And we can see quite a bit of water dripping out through there. And some very small fish down in there. here and see what we can see. It's a fish net. Down in there is where the water is. Heard of some kind of bug. There's a water pipe here too for some reason. And so here we are, looking down into the well itself. Or what would have been the place where people went after their water. There's still a 4-inch plastic pipe dropped down in there right now to suck water out. For what reason, one wonders. Although this water is fairly good, all told, fish net. I mean, what a great tourist attraction. At least they're not throwing too much trash in here. Or maybe it's that Irishman that keeps it moderately clean. What a tourist attraction. Glad there's nobody here. Ironically, none of these Bayari, and there are 3 of them, are mentioned on the tourist map, or the Lonely Planet map, or even I think in the Lonely Planet guide. If that's the case, if my memory is correct, it illustrates once again how lax Lonely Planet is. Here's a little interesting side feature. Supports a small balcony. Bill Haynes' flying rats. But here, protected if not revered. A little bit of detail. You can see these steps just go up to this little landing and then back down, up and back down. You wonder if that was done just for design, or whether that was once the exterior grade, and that beyond that used to be little places for people to gather in the shade. I want to go over and see what's on the other side of that wall there. It doesn't look old, but it kind of looks interesting in a prurient kind of way. Probably a replacement of iron, but it may well reflect almost the same exact design that was used in wood in the early day. Whether this urn was here or not, I don't know, but it's certainly appropriately picturesque. This appears to be a little shrine, but it's such a new looking building. One wonders, these sweat-filled lives, does that reflect? Just poke my head inside of what is probably an old valley. Who knows how many families live in it now. But it certainly had a nice location in the day, right next to that stepwell. The stepwell we were at is right across the street over there, behind that building with the posts, I believe it was. And I'll pan across to the lake. There's that house that arched over the road. It was a pretty important structure in its day. Notice that it extended quite a distance down there, but this lake was probably the reserve of a very wealthy coterie of merchants, I would guess. Backed up by the fort that we'll perhaps visit later today. This reminds me so much of some of the kings all around the world that had their own private reserve, including a private lake. Now there's an archway. Could that temple in the background be reached by boat? Was that the elegance of these folks? That looks like carpet, or not carpet, but lawn. At first I thought it was, but I'll be graciously poetic and call it a green slough. It actually looks quite neat, were it not for the trash floating on the trash. More fighter jets up there. You can hear them roaring about as they were in summer. I wonder if it isn't something they do to let the Pakistani know they can, because this is not that far from the Pakistani border. Zalsimer was even closer. Up on top, just to get the full view of all of this. Notice the buttresses against that wall, and the two, what look like the bases of towers. That may well have been one of these beautiful homes that was raised at some point and the junk put in instead. With the fort in the background, I'll pan through this area we've just walked. You can just imagine what a regal place it was to live when it was completely surrounded by those big, beautiful, and important homes. Here we can see a remnant of the ones that were at this end. Enough left to restore. And there's some sense of beauty in this one in particular. It's interesting. It looks like there were stairways, and at some time might have been a way of actually getting some kind of boat or vehicle down here, but there's made have been for boats right here. Notice that feature right there. There's something that's like a post there, and it looks like it's the kind of thing you could throw a rope around. Could have been a landing site. There might be stairs that we can't see beneath this boxy thing. But let's take a closer look at this building. I'll go in closer so we can try to get some of the detail that remains. Again, this is simply a cement applique that's painted probably. Some kind of athletics going on over there. Probably a very contained game of cricket. Yep. Lightly on it. Imagine the day the artist finished this and thought to himself, oh, I've done a grand thing here. I'm going to pan down on this cylindrical, whatever you want to call it, but it's a balcony type of detail feature, just so you can get a sense of its overall design, and then we'll look more closely at the remaining detail. Now we're looking under one of those typical canopies that we see over doors on the Havelis in Jaisalmer. And this is over these little archway windows. I'm going to poke into this little side portion of that arch canopy, doorway or windowway. This is interesting. It looks like it's part of the walkway up from the water, and it is. And it looks like it was designed to be a little place where you could sit once upon a time and look at the peeps going by. Or maybe it was also an access into the house from this position. And now we're looking at the remains of the back side of that house we just looked at. And now I'm wondering whether, in fact, this channel wasn't just a waterway. It seems sloped for quite a distance. Maybe this was part of the system for filling the lake. Duh. And the remains of these homes. I'll walk down to this next bridge. I'm wearing a mask, but it's gathered so much stench in it that I think it is smelling bad to me. Unless I just walked through some stench I didn't realize was stench. You can see this wanders up. I'm sure this was a canal that channeled water into that lake. Pretty tree in the middle of this little neighborhood inside of a block. It's a group of apartment houses, probably the remnants of older homes, not quite as elegant as the ones on the lake, but in their day, a lower tier of important people. Yeah, I've just been navigating by kind of the sun towards what I know is one of the few high spots in this whole area, and I think this must be it. But you can see part of it because there was a wall and that pinnacle that we saw yesterday with the little tower on top, so that's what we're in search of. Now you can see some kind of temple up on top.